Should I use this? Yeah. Probably. I hate microphones. Okay. So I know majority of people in this room have this like existentialism rooted in BoJack Horseman, Rick and Morty, where existence is pain in my head and stuff like that. But what I'm gonna tell you is existence is pain for people who don't have food to eat, who don't have healthcare, who don't have all of these stuff. So even insofar that they can claim that some of the people in this society might not be content fully and fully self-actualized and all of this stuff, we believe that the most important thing in this debate is not to torture people, but not allowing them to have food, meaningful, how do you say, basic necessities, which is like the lowest people in our society currently. What I regrettably, Janko, has opened my minds to in this debate is that this is not the book. This is a debate. So everything that they might know from reading a book, which I also know, still needs to be proven and still needs to be weighed. So you might know what happens in a book. Don't spoil it to people. You still have to prove. You still have to prove your points on your side of the house. So you might know A, B, C, and other types of it, but the world can look like people indoctrinating you into believing like collectivism and completely being content with what you are, which is probably what is going to happen given the info slide on our side of the house. So framing. This world is pretty much the same, bar two things. First of all, that this is a stable world, which means that there is no change in social order. We're going to prove to you why changing social order is not good. And second of all, that this is brings people basic necessity and utility, which is actually what wins us the debate outright. So, first of all, why free will doesn't exist? Yay. Cool. So we define free will as the ability to choose other outcomes for your life other than what is actually happening or what is ought to happen by random circumstances that you are plagued with. What are these random circumstances that you're plagued with? So every future decision and every decision that anybody's making is conditioned by any previous decision that was made overall. And not just like decisions, right? It's like genetics, evolution, and social values that arose in like random order and stuff. It's all influencing what I am believing, why I'm here, where I am in this sort of situation. So the fact that people have the sense of free will doesn't mean that necessarily free will exists, and it actually doesn't. But what we should care about in this world is then the utility of the people who are the most disenfranchised, who cannot express and who by random lottery and throw of the dice have received like punishment, internal punishment of torture and horribleness that is existence in abject poverty and stuff like that. So let's talk about these people. So notice that when your material and physical needs are met, which is stated by the info slide, only thing that is constant and they cannot refute under our side of the house, which basically means there is no abject poverty. But it also basically means there is no poverty, because like majority of people who are poor also don't have their needs fulfilled and stuff like that. But let me translate that into human language for people to understand. Probably, yeah. So what does this mean? What does this mean? This means less hungry people, less people who need healthcare, who are dying and stuff like that, and less people who need to take up loans in order to cure their child from doing something like this. This might most sound, less healthcare, you're talking about, how do you say, something that is basic. But notice that when you're hungry, this is basically somebody inflicting a pain upon your stomach, upon your guts, and you feeling horrible about it and stuff like that. Notice that also biology kicks in, right? Like this is something where you cannot control your hormones that are it's completely changing the way you're making decisions, you're making whatever it is. It's changing your outcome and your state of mind and stuff like that. So it's not only a physical pain that we want to avoid by all costs because it's biologically rooted that you want to avoid pain. But what I can posit to them is, would you torture terrorists if that will lead to a better outcome? Defend that in your leader of the opposition speech, please. Okay, but it's also about psychological pain that people are experiencing from feeling of the hopelessness of, how do you say, not having the basic needs fulfilled under their side of a house. This is, on our comparative, at least the lowest people on both sides of the house is like much higher on our side of the house, and we don't have abject torture. So they might still say, but there's still some harms on our world, but nothing is as harmful as you being hungry, as you dying from hunger, as your kid dying from a disease that was completely preventable, as it's happening in majority of Western liberal democracies. I mean, healthcare is still an issue. Why the fuck are you doing this, America? Yeah, okay, so that's one. Second thing, why is changing the social position is first of all non-comparative, but second of all not good even if they prove that it's a comparative. First of all, notice that system in their side of a house in status quo is rooted in a couple of things. It's basically capitalism in Western liberal democracies. But what does it mean? It's connected by vastly different interests and vastly different complex systems that are, how do you say, anti-fragile to change and stuff like that on their side of a house, which means that some things might change, but they are minute in comparison, and the system pretty much stays the same. But even if it changes to the certain, like also lots of people, a couple of more mechanisms, let's prove it a bit more. Lots of people have status quo bias. Lots of people fear change because the majority of people, how do you say, don't like and fear that change is something that can necessarily bring them something that is worse than they have in the status quo. So the people who might want change are people on our side of a house. What change would they want? Is this change that we're proposing under our side of a house. People who do not want change on their side of a house and who want things to stay constant are people who are pretty much already have these basic necessities fulfilled under our side of a house. So insofar that people want revolution, they want revolution to lead to our world. The problem is on their side of a house, the revolution is pretty much uncertain. Yes, opening.
Democracy is precisely something that is not status quo bias. The collectivization of workers in the middle class has meant that largely the status quo, the amount of poverty has reduced by significant amounts.
Sure, it has reduced. I don't care. There's still poverty. There's still abject poverty. People are still dying from unnecessary things. I don't care if you prove 50, 100 years and stuff like that, that you're going to solve this. We do it in a poof by the virtue of the motion being set and stuff like that. So just compare the hardness that they have to go through versus a poof from the info slide. Okay, so notice the change in the social system doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes for people. Notice the majority of revolutions that happened previously. Iran, communist revolutions previously, despite what Harvard might have wanted you to believe in that finals. So yeah, majority of revolution and majority of stuff is plagued by people having horrible interest and being self-interested, even if they want to change initially, like revolution, eating his children and stuff like that. So this means that usually people who die the most after revolution, die the most of changing the social order, like, because social order is uprooting everything that we have, is uprooting the economy, uprooting our manufacturing system and stuff like that, leaving a lot more people in poverty and a lot more elites on the top of the hierarchy, like it happened in every communist revolution on their side of the house. So change is not desirable. It's basically non-comparative, and we eliminate poverty and torture on their side of the house. So please vote opening government. Thank you.
My happiness is not just a composition of my material and physical needs. In the darkest moments of my depression, the problem was not that I was alienated from the material world. I was alienated from myself and my own sense of identity. Thank God for finding my aspirations in the social relations like Chin to help me out of it. And the problem with the Brave New World is that it alienates humanity from itself and makes it a slave to the slave master of the state. I'm going to prove 3 different things in this speech. First, I want to talk about why it is principally illegitimate that you have a Brave New World. Second of all, I want to talk about practically why it is that the marginal benefits are incredibly small and the harms are massive to disadvantaged groups. And lastly, I just want to talk about net happiness and human aspirationalism. So, what is the principle in this debate? I think the thing that is important to observe is that on-side proposition, they place far too much trust in the state. And the important thing is that freedom is relational. For instance, slavery is wrong even if you provide all your basic material and physical needs to that slave, even if you give them the right to travel. I want to posit a thought experiment to you here. Imagine having a fence with a gate that is unlocked. You can always go through that gate. The more free world is the one in which that fence does not exist in the very first place because you can choose the options of what you want and you have no barriers to impede you. Why is that important in this debate? Because the world that the proposition creates is a state which can determine what system that they have, a benevolent autocracy which you can influence by changing the human genome and by affecting individual social conditioning. I think it is a world in which individuals' autonomy, no thank you, and preferences are undermined. Why is it on the comparative that we prefer Western liberal democracies then? You can collectivize the change. We recognize that it is an imperfect system, but it's a system in which you still have a massive amount of lower class and middle class people who can organize, who can protest, who can go to the ballot box, and that preference aggregation and the very expression of that preference is a basic good in of itself. Furthermore, the basic protections that exist for things like the right to protest. Now, I know what they're going to say. They're going to say these preferences matter not at all, precisely because of the fact that preferences are arbitrary, and the fact that you can fix these preferences is a good in and of itself. What is the harm that comes from this? First of all, I want to say that in the status quo, the free will argument is relatively insubstantial, because even if we have our free will imposed upon us and are socially conditioned, we have competing different preferences that are still acting. For instance, the pressure to be world champions for Chennai versus the social expectation that we should just relax and that is better for us. So we always have multiple competing preferences, and that state will always try and dictate and limit the options that we have for one. I think it is an important thought experiment to recognize, for instance, that even if an individual has a strong preference to, for instance, be a heroin addict, that does not mean that it is a meaningful preference. The utility machine that Nozick talks about does not aggregate and express what is actually good for you. And the important thing to note is that preferences can have different weight, i.e. I can have multiple preferences. In a counterfactual world, I can have a preference to not be the world champion, but that doesn't mean that it makes me as happy as the preference to be a world champion. So just because you have a fixed preference does not mean that the utility that you get from that preference is any different, or is the same on both sides, because preferences have different ways that they act upon you and different ways that you can be happy from them. Sure.
This argument is just the state should give you all the preferences. In the status quo, the state determines where you live, where you go to school, often excludes you from voting. So you really have more preferences.
Okay, but think about this. That is true for a subset of people, and maybe mostly in America, not in Finland or other places. You cannot take the worst case example of Western liberal democracies. You have to take the mean. And the mean is a world in which you have pretty decent quality of life. So you can't win this debate on OG or CG by exaggerating that the US is really bad, because everyone in this room agrees that the US is really bad. Talk about other Western liberal democracies, please. So, on practical outcomes in this debate. And the first thing that I want to point out is that characterization as to why there can be change. Structurally, it is true that there will always be a critical voting bloc that can change these kinds of systems based on the structure of capitalism itself, i.e. large capital owners have to extract gains from multiple people in order to become rich. So they have to have a large class of working class individuals to extract that money from. And the important thing is therefore that there is a large voter bloc, no thank you, that has some degree of power to influence it. And that is why you see socialist policies starting to be implemented in large parts of the world, while the amount of poverty is quite small. And we can see you probably marginally win on the 3% of people who are extremely impoverished in the mean Western liberal democracy. We think that is unimportant compared to the impact that we're going to propose. Because we think in order for the opening government to win, they need to have a totalizing system of conditioning, that a state who is afraid of their power being usurped is most likely in this characterization going to embark on radically powerful policies to try and indoctrinate people. So for instance, proactivity, separating social classes so that people do not see the inequality that exists within that system, putting them in systematically worse neighborhoods that even if their basic material and physical needs are met, they're worse off, suppressing protest, and if any person chooses to protest, that 1% of people who are aspirational, those people will be cracked down upon and put into re-education camps. Why is it necessarily the case that even with the conditioning that they talk about, you will still have that sort of agitation? There are two different reasons. First of all, humans are aspirational. We are the only species which can compare and understand ourselves relationally to one another. So we are able to see, for instance, that someone else is better off and that we want to be able to strive to that position, even if I am in an objectively good position. For instance, I should be happy that I'm a world semifinalist, but you'll be damned if I'm happy if I don't, I'll be happy if I don't make the finals. So that is an important thing, and the comparative is a world in which you can use the ballot box to express that preference, that even if it's imperfect, you're able to have a marginal improvement on that and express that aspirational nature rather than having to go through protest or other risky means. No, thank you. Stability is a bad thing precisely in the cases that if we can prove the status quo is harmful, and you have a much higher burden to just say revolution can sometimes be bad. Look at the Hong Kong Revolution, which we posit, if it was successful, would lead to a democratic system. So the end outcomes can be oftentimes good. The second thing I want to point out is that humans are social. No man is an island, and we place ourselves within groups, and we understand ourselves within group identity. That That is why ant colony cannot understand themselves as an identity compared to humans. And the important thing to note here is that the fact that humans are social means that we construct a meaning. The ability to have social relationships out of your class is valuable. Just because Chin is Singaporean, I wish I could still be friends with him, but it also suggests why it is that we are relational, because we define ourselves in groups and then oppositional to other groups. The last thing I want to talk about is net happiness. Even if you don't think that you're going to have strict crackdowns, we think it is still wrong because it is important that people long for more, and that is natural for what people have. We are not the Homo economicus. We compare ourselves to one another rather than just on objective standards, as I've suggested before. And the huge inequality makes you feel relatively worse off and makes you feel unhappy. That's why more equal places that are poor, like Bhutan, are more happy places, because there's no one to compare yourself to. The comparative in this debate is not perfection, but it is the hope and ability to change the system. It is the idea that you can have some degree of influence and some kind of hope, and that gives you reassurance to make you happy and feel like every day is worth living, that you can wake up in the morning because there's a meaningful change that you can make. The world that we view is tied to our emotions, the lens we view our lives through is important, and the fireworks that come off when we are friends is something that is valuable. Remarkably proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay. One thing that we get from the info slide in this debate is the fact, can I talk from, yes, I can. Okay, one thing we get from the info slide is the fact that people do not have ability to rebel. If people cannot rebel and overthrow this social system that exists, there are two possible options. Option number one is that they're so satisfied that they feel absolutely no need to overthrow the system in the first place. And option number two is that we import these things into their consciousness. That is to say, we give them pills or we give them, I don't know, some neural inputs into their brain. It doesn't really matter. On both of these, we win. But note that if everything that Jason says is true, how people care their preference, how they want freedom, how they have all these sorts of different things that makes them unhappy, this probably means that if we buy the premise of the motion, which is people are not going to rebel, meaning that the world has no chance of being as bad place as opening opposition is trying to present to you in the first place, or their consciousness is going to be altered in a way so they don't, which is already what's happening in the status quo because we are conditioned by our neurobiology. Then they tell us, oh, but preferences can be wild, so wild and different, they're so important for us to feel happy. Note, even in the status quo, we make preferences in relation to situation that we are put in. I do not have same preferences as my great-grandfather did. In fact, we have completely different preferences because he, at the time of his life, knew what he could expect from life. For instance, he knew that he couldn't have an iPhone. I know that I can have an iPhone, so I may strive for this. What he strove for is maybe to build a house in Belgrade where he can live, and then my grandfather would inherit this house. Those were his preferences. People who lived in ancient Egypt had very different preferences than 19th century United Kingdom, okay? We adjust our preferences to situations we are put in. And this happens even if things change suddenly, such as, I don't know, Bolshevik revolution in Russia, suddenly if you were an aristocrat and now you're hiding in a basement, your preferences all of a sudden become a bit different. And since the conditions that put you into having these preferences are already random and opening opposition considers they're random, I'm really not sure what the comparative is on this preferences point. Second thing we tell you, what is the comparative in this debate is the utility, because there is no such a thing as culpability or immorality, because we are conditioned by what has been happened before in the timeline of our life. When I was born, and then my parents raised me, and then when I make some first active decision, let's call it so, illusion of an active decision, these were all conditioned by all the previous things, and then every decision I make in the future is conditioned by all the set of previous decisions that were made. Moreover, we tell you you're conditioned by genetics, you're conditioned by randomness. Maybe you got some disease, maybe car hits and kills someone you love, maybe black swans happen, systems collapse, economies clashes, people lose People lose everything in economic. We don't know what may happen in life and what is conditioning this. I want to take closings extension.
Yeah, so your entire rebuttal to saying why people revolt. Presumably people could also not revolt because they're overwhelmed by cynicism and pessimism, as we learned from yesterday's debate.
Yes, but if Jason makes the premise that in the status quo, people can achieve some change, low classes and middle classes, why wouldn't people achieve such change on both sides of the house? But moreover, what we tell you is why this is likely to happen is because when we solve the problems of global poverty that does not only exist in the United States of America, but all across minorities, communities living in Western liberal democracies, we get much more beneficial results and much more satisfied people for people who are the most disenfranchised. Note the comparative. The people that we talk about in this debate, the same things that are given to us in the info slide, on their side of the house have nothing. They don't have, their preferences are never fulfilled according to team in opening oppositions because they cannot access the things that are premises to even getting preferences. There are many people in Western liberal democracies who never traveled to a foreign country their entire life. There are many people who take mortgage in order to pay healthcare for their kid. Even if healthcare in their country exists, maybe it is inaccessible, so you need to pay for something. So you need to pay for something in some different country. Secondly, we tell you, in the lack of those basic necessities, what we are telling you is that you live in a constant state of pain, which is by the utilitarian metric, the worst thing that can happen to human condition, because this is something that we can actually measure through, through fMRI and other, neuroscience engineering novelties that humans have been able to put. This means that if you don't have money to eat good food, so you have to go and buy at 7-Eleven every day, this means that you will have a stomachache. But this is also applicable to every little thing that you're able to buy in life. Note that in the status quo, in all the Western liberal democracies, we have opioid crisis. So people who are dissatisfied with the way their life looks like and how they cannot escape this poverty. Why do people smoke crack? Rich people do not smoke crack, okay? People who smoke crack are those who, just cannot get out of their skin of how difficult the situation is. On our side of the house government, we alleviate that pain by the notion of the info slide. This is given to us. What they have to do is prove their thing. Oh, and then I just forgot to respond to this point about slavery. You don't say slavery and get away with this. You're a slave because state coerces you. No shit, state coerces me. If I don't pay my taxes, policeman will come and pull me over, so he takes my money. And if I say, no, I don't want to give you money, he will break my hand if it is necessary to take me off to police station and to take this money away from me, as well as to all the laws that I personally have preference not to oblige in the status quo, and I cannot, guess what, change my citizenship. If I don't know, give me Singaporean citizenship, I will gladly take it and give my Serbian away. Unfortunately, in the status quo, this is not something that I can do. So I'm telling you that in the status quo, I'm already slave of the state, because if I don't comply with these laws, which in 50 years we may find super immoral, the same way we look at Jim Crows now that happened in the 1960s, okay? Only 50 days ago from some time distance. His slavery in this is not comparative. The comparative is how can you self-actualize, and how the poorest of the poorest, who cannot achieve in the first place what they want to achieve, how these people are going to self-actualize. What we tell you in this debate, the only way that you can adjudicate is by consequentialism. We are the team that brings you the best consequentialism. It doesn't matter whether my lack of choice is given from nature or from the government. Proud to propose.
I think it's important to peel back the euphemisms of genetic engineering and social conditioning, because that seems to be opening government's magic bullet. And I want you to understand just how antithetical these things are to our deepest hopes and desires. First, it means alienating you from yourself. You do not have autonomy. You do not have dreams. You just need to be a polished gear in an unfeeling machine. Two, it means cracking down on dissidents, because stability, per their first speaker, is purchased at the cost of imprisoning critics. Because if you so much as speak out against the regime, you are sent to re-education camps. They say the motion slide tells us people cannot rebel. No, check your phones. Point number 3 says there is no possibility of changing the social order. There might be, for example, no possibility for me to kill all of you. Doesn't mean I can't try. Doesn't mean I can't come screaming towards you and slapping all of you, even though I don't succeed. And we think that the motion slide does not give them fiat to say that people are didn't. Third, it also means deadening some of the most powerful, effective emotions in our human psyche that give us happiness. The removal of hope, of aspiration, and of the chance of rebellion. So at the end of my introduction, I ask you to ask them a question. At what price, Yanko? Prosperity. Because for OG, prosperity is purchased at the cost of cauterizing the human soul. I talk to you about 5 things. 1. Why do people sacrifice material well-being for intangible goods like democracy? I put to you that factual claims, like the Brexit vote, how people took back control even though they were materially poorer, or Hong Kong protesters who rejected their future as investment banking analysts and consultants so they could fight on the front lines for universal suffrage, are empirical evidence that material comfort is deeply insufficient for happiness. Life is a pursuit of meaning. Just surface, raw existence without any further internal narrative is what increases the likelihood of depression and severe nihilism. That is why Bhutan is happier than Hong Kong. This is why people tend to be deeply unhappy in countries like China, in countries where you don't have the ballot, where you're unable to organize, because people feel that their lives are being led by someone else, that you are just a puppet in the capitalist machine with no capacity to have autonomy. So it is in their paradigm that they have more pain, they have more depression, they have more nihilism, they have more mental disorder. They say, second, this is the second part of my speech, that people's preferences change over time and they are better able to reflect it. I'm not sure why they bring this up, because Jason tells you that it is democracy that serves a preference aggregating function. So I can accept their premise. Let's say people's preferences change over time. But that's why people's voting preferences, the review preference to the majority, also map onto changing preferences. But in their side, they have to lock in preferences at one time slice. They have to poll everybody, determine what people's preferences are, and then genetically engineer from that point onwards. It is their side that doesn't recognize that preferences change. But let's be clear, because I think all of you are wondering, what is the problem with being born with genetically programmed preferences? Because it seems to me that I'm doing a cheat, right? I'm taking an external perspective and applying it to a subjective perspective. So here's the problem. The problem with being born with genetically programmed preferences is that you don't feel autonomous, even if you may not actually be autonomous, because you feel that your entire life is led, strung along by deterministic things. So even if the world we live in is a deterministic one, at least we give ourselves the illusion of autonomy, that I know when I swing my hands, it is not some random law of physics that's causing me to swing my hands. And this gives me power to know that I control my life, that I am able to define my relationships with people, that I am able to be the protagonist in my own life story. But in a deterministic world, even within the subjective perspective of someone whose preferences are conditioned by the state, that individual feels like an automaton. That individual feels like they are being led by a state that has determined for them what their life plays out, even though their preferences are real to them. That is why Jason gives you the analogy of the heroin addict. Why is it that the heroin addict, in his moment of sobriety, even if he may not always be sober, really regrets taking heroin, even though those preferences are real? It's because the heroin addict realizes that their positive freedom is being curtailed, that they're unable to control their addiction to the heroin. They're being led by some external force in the same way they are being led by the external force on their side by the state. No, thank you. Third thing I want to talk about. Maybe Yanko is correct. Material well-being is indeed a precondition for happiness. I mean, I concede this is probably true. But first, look at Jason's mitigation about how in most liberal Western democracies, this precondition tends to be met and we are on a path to improvement. This doesn't flip the point, it just mitigates. But I want to note here that a precondition is non-equivalent to sufficiency. So lots of people on your side have the preconditions for happiness. Good job. Because very few people actually have the sufficient conditions for happiness. There are very few people who are actually happy on your side, even if you meet the relevant preconditions. So by their own utilitarian metric, we win. Fourth, on what Yanko says about pain minimization utilitarianism. Maybe it is not about maximizing happiness, it's about minimizing pain. But on your side, all of Jason's harms cause pain. The fact, for example, that I'm not allowed to feel hope if I'm droning away as a gear in that machine. The fact, for example, that I have a higher likelihood of suffering things like schizophrenia and depression because I feel that the state is the one controlling me, not myself controlling my own life. So on your side, you also have a very large amount of pain. But before I go on, yes?
Even if you buy your unproven premise, yet that you do not have the sense of free choice, how are minorities in West on food stamps living life as protagonists and heroes of their own life?
But I think this is actually deeply elitist, I'm sorry. Because lots of individuals, regardless of their material conditions, genuinely do find value in their lives. Like the family, the friends, the jobs they work. Even if you might not think that somebody flipping burgers in McDonald's has a deep, complex, meaningful internal life, I assure you, they do. Back to my case. So we think even on their metric of pain minimization, utilitarianism, they lose because they have deep mental and psychological problems. Number 5, slavery. I love what Yanko says. The state is coercive. If I steal the watch, the policeman break my hand. Correct. So the state is coercive, right? That is exactly the premise for why we should have the vote. Because the coercive power of the state is the justification for people having ability to shape those laws. Because it is illegitimate for a state to have coercive power on someone if that someone is also unable to similarly reflect back on the state and stop the state through voting for an alternative political party or changing the laws. It is exactly that premise that feeds into Jason's argument. So thank you for proving our point that there is a principled legitimacy to democracy that prevents state overreach, and also a principled legitimacy to the point that we avoid a relational inequality that creates slavery. For all these reasons, I have never been prouder to oppose.
Is that too loud, too quiet? I used to believe at one point in time that with age came wisdom. The opening half of this debate has firmly dispossessed me of that conviction. The claim from opening opposition is that people do not feel autonomous. The problem here is I think more people feel powerless, feel stripped of their autonomy by poverty, by illness, by discrimination, that stop them from making a whole range of other choices other than their occupation that are probably more meaningful to the human good. There may well be no convincing single answer to the human good, and that's why the extension from closing government is very simple. Material happiness is a precondition to accessing almost any other form, and indeed to deciding for yourself what human happiness is. But I want to note at the top, I think it is very unlikely that the conception of human happiness we have arrived at as per opening opposition is correct. That is, your place in the social order should determine your happiness. The job that you do and the level of prosperity in financial terms associated with it. I think there are very many more important things to human happiness, and that is going to be our extension. Before that, I want to delete opening opposition for the round. First, the principle that the state has too much power. The problem with this principle, as pointed out by our POI, is that the state already has this amount of power, but it uses it in different ways and more subtle ways. That is, the reason that we believe literally everything in this round is because we have come through education systems that has taught us to put certain value by certain things. We are constrained by laws that tell us that certain behaviors should be done and should not be done. So they claim that, like, oh, the state now has a monopoly to tell people, and this is the opening government response that feeds back to them. The claim that the government having an ability to tell people what they should want is unjustifiable is exactly the status quo. The principle is not a real argument. I think their pragmatic argument is the most compelling one they make. That is, the people are aspirational, they have social relationships. A couple of things here. First, this argument literally rebuts itself. That is, if you condition people to believe that their societal role is what they will fulfill, but it is not the sum of what they should aim for, presumably they no longer care about the fact that someone else is a lawyer and they are a bricklayer because they have defined themselves as a product of more than just their occupation. But three more responses here. First, I think this is entirely symmetric. That is, people are more likely to weigh themselves relative to others at the moment and feel injustice when they see my material needs are not being met, but the material needs of others are being met. I cannot feed my children, but others can. I think that is what causes people to be angry. They say, oh, fine, like bankers as an example, people that have everything joining the fight. Why would they do that? I think in many instances this is a great example. People join the fight out of trying to fulfill the material needs of others. They see the injustice foisted upon others and that motivates them. But in a world where everyone else also has their material needs fulfilled, I think this drops out of the round. Third, I would posit this is perhaps one of the best things that would ever happen for social justice, because the way this actually works, if anyone had actually fucking read the book, is that every generation, every person that is born, is randomly assigned these traits, which means you remove basically all racism from society, for example, because it is no longer certain races picking certain other races. It is done on a random basis, and you move certain people into certain positions and move certain people out of other positions. I think that means almost all of their material about people having a desire to overthrow the system is taken out of the round. Second, human autonomy, and this is where we clash most directly with opening opposition, and why we maximize it in closing government. Any conception of the human good relies on basic biological needs being fulfilled. And they say you can't change the social order, but I think there are many competing versions of happiness that are probably more likely to be legitimate than the one that 21st century capitalism has foisted upon us. Family, the joy of being a father, your friendships and the connections you form there, romance and romantic relationships, your ability to read and discover things in literature and philosophy, your ability to go outdoors and experience the natural beauty of the world, your ability to consume things like art and music, the joy of teaching to other people. There are a huge range of things that people derive their happiness from, all of which they are structurally shut out of for 4 reasons by a lack of material sustenance. 1, no thank you. The precondition of health. That is, you literally need to be alive to be a family member, to be a friend, to be a lover. You need to have the strength to go outdoors. You need to have the strength to interact with others in order to decide what is valuable for you in the very first instance. They presume the social order is the only thing that people care about. I think that people would care much more about having the choice to decide for themselves what they should care about. No thank you. Second, the precondition of time. That is, you literally need free time to cultivate friendships, to cultivate relationships, to have time to read in the first place. If your needs are not met, so you're fighting to put food on the table at the end of every week, you do not have the time to explore these options. You do not have time to decide what the human good you want to structure your life around is in the first place. Third, the precondition of wealth. No thank you. That loads of the things that we derive human happiness from rely on you being able to acquire those material goods. So that is, we are literally giving people more autonomy when we satisfy their material needs, because in many cases we're giving them the cash with which to buy the books, to buy the music, to buy the literature, to buy the experiences, the like nights out with their children, the fine food, whatever it is that allows them to then make better decisions about what their happiness are. No thank you. Fourth, third parties. That is, and this is perhaps where we best rebut opening opposition, they say maybe only a small population or a portion of the population are discriminated against or suffer hugely. I think the key here is that loads of other people in society are dragged into the mess trying to look after those individuals. That is, trying to support your family member who's gone off the rails and doesn't have a job, trying to support your ailing aunt who is not provided for by the healthcare system. All of these things further constrain the autonomy of individuals. The way we know this should be a precondition in the round is that we let parents choose how to raise their children and constrain some of their autonomy in many ways. For example, foist a value system on them, perhaps because we allow that is the best way to maximize the autonomy of the child in the future, to expose them to a broad range of things, to put them on a platform from which they can make decisions when they grow up. I think there are 2 possible opposition responses to this argument. The first is that you have to give up change to the social order. Maybe. But I ask you, why do we care about the fact that someone is a lawyer and that you are a bricklayer if you have all of your material needs fulfilled, all of your family members' material needs fulfilled, all of your friends' material needs fulfilled, if you have more time to decide what the human good is? This is a circular argument. They presume people care about the existing social order, and so we should prioritize that. But the only reason people care about the social order is because it's the only value system we're foisting upon people. We're telling people you should measure yourself on what job you have, you should measure yourself on how much wealth you have. We reject that premise. We think we should give people the basic need to find out what is valuable for themselves. I think the second possible opposition response to this argument is to say that individuals can still be depressed. Maybe. And that is very regrettable. In closing government, we don't have all the answers to all the questions, and no one in the round can claim to. But I would point out that rates of depression are far higher against discriminated minorities. They are far higher against individuals that suffer from mental health illnesses as a result of things like stress, as a result of things like not having literally food to put on their table to feed their children at the end of the week. I think, and this is the extension from closing government, all access to autonomy is preconditioned on a certain level of material satisfaction, a certain level of biological satisfaction. If you believe any of the tyranny rhetoric coming out, especially from the deputy leader of the opposition, you're voting closing government in this round, because we're the only team that tell you you maximize autonomy, you maximize the ability to choose, you maximize the ability to escape the kind of capitalist foist onto you that you should care about your job when you have the time, when you're healthy, when you can choose things for yourself. Very proud to propose.
We good? Three things in my speech today. First, why is life in Western liberal democracies not that bad for 95% of people, and for the other 5% of people, things would get better in the next 50 years? Secondly, why we now perpetuate a caste-like system of social stratification and functionalism-based stigmatization against 100% of people in these countries? Thirdly, what exactly are the limits of programmability, and why is everything from government on that front really, really dumb? And fourthly, what makes a good life, and how do we weigh between social relations, individual aspirations and fulfillment against some more material needs being satisfied? First though, on the extension, I want to note here, panel, that everyone in this debate, as with contemporary debating, likes to talk about the minorities, the oppressed, those who suffer. I think they do matter, but I also want to talk about the other 95% of individuals whose lives are worth caring because they have preferences, they have stories to tell, they have desires that we ought to respect. Just because not members of minorities does not render them irrelevant in moral calculus. I would posit that for all of these individuals, if I improve to you in my second extension, life gets worse and that life is not that bad right now, we win on this subset. There are four reasons why it's not that bad for them. A, because Western liberal democracies have uniquely greater purchasing power against other countries around them that allows them to generally engage in trade and also aggregative improvements in quality of life for all of these individuals. Secondly, because of the hyperconnectivity of the modern age, which means that modern technologies and advancements improve the quality of life of these people in a way that maximize their freedom and autonomy per CG. Thirdly, because fundamentally, we think that there's an aggregative lifting of social standards and quality of life that improves everyone's lives, even those who are poorest, because those who are privileged would lobby for changes that presumably also trickle down to those who are poor in terms of more bridges, more infrastructure, more schools. When you improve human capital, you also improve the lowest depths of what Western liberal democracy looks like. And fourthly, there's a basic safety net that, yes, has flaws and loopholes, but gradually improving. You might think, why the hell is any of this relevant? This is relevant because for the 95% of these individuals, all of the harms in my second point really do apply and really demonstrate that there's a net loss there. But then let's talk about 5% of those who are very poor. OO says, they can vote. I don't know how many of them vote. They probably don't in really, gerrymandered elections. But I'd posit there are three reasons why the poor are taken care of, at least in a short to medium or medium to long term, such that if you look at this motion, right, it doesn't say it is better now. It is an extrapolatory motion. So if we can prove to you that from 50 years onwards until like the end of humanity, that we get infinitely better comparisons than their side, then even though there's a short-term sort of risk of not meeting this ideal, we still win on that front. There are three reasons why there's an evolution towards that. A, late-stage capitalism. The likelihood here is that in many cases, the capitalists and industrialists are already being pummeled by the technological revolution to the extent that they realize they cannot rely simply on monopoly and screwing over labor rights in order to maximize revenue. Therefore, they want to care about the working class to some extent because these are the people from which the consumer markets and also potential talents and innovation come from. Two, because progressives increasingly measure the quality and salience and morality of politicians based on how much they help the poor. So I might be a woke liberal and therefore vote on a basis of how much you help the poor. I think woke liberals are more likely than poor to vote here. And finally, and fundamentally, there's a gradual lifting of everyone. Note the fact that HDI in China has improved immensely over the past 60 years. And they might say, oh, but this is an anomaly. But this is also indicative of the fact that in a vast majority of poorer countries and poorer democracies, there's a massive uplifting in quality of life. So if you extrapolate this into the long run, I think in general, the imperative necessity is undercut. Second extension then, what are the harms that apply to 100% of all people here today? Three things I want to note, and a key premise here is to say that fundamentally, the way we see other people, and see how they choose and how they act becomes different on the side for two reasons. One, because we see them as equal. And two, because we see them as because of the functionalization of how we imagine others' roles and also positions in society. That a Brave New World is one, as pointed out by Gov, defined by whom you are. You're a lawyer, you're a businessman, you're born into that, and you remain there. That, I'd posit, is very similar to the caste system in India that has plagued and impoverished millions of people because of the constriction upon their liberty. But secondly, it is also the idea that these people's choices are not genuinely their own, such that the efforts and the work they perform cannot be attributed to their intelligence or their own choices because they are engineered to do so. Now, the standard response from GovBench is, this happens anyway. That's a very lazy response for the very simple fact that, yeah, it happens anyway in some cases. Now, it happens in all cases. And that's the reason why it's terrible for them to give that response. What are the impacts here? There are 7 impacts I want to go through. The first is that you're more likely to get social stratification based upon divides and based upon relations that are ordered by value hierarchies. By that I mean that you would always see others, a Brahmin, for instance, interacting with people from the lower classes as someone that's defined by a career that's inferior to you, that's not as good as you. And note here, the inability of them to change means that there's no incentive for you to engage and treat them as equals or egalitarians. Secondly, you can't enter or cross sociological cleavages to develop relationships with people you love. You might love a Brahmin if you're from a class or a functional class that's ranked as inferior to that class, but you can't enter into relationships there because your sociological communities are likely to be segmented and segregated. Thirdly, and the reason why they can't just say, oh, you adjust and adapt and all that, is because there are certain industries and occupations that are seen as just more socially utile to society than others. That is the whole logic that underpins the caste system in India. Not necessarily the fact that it is a pummeled and concocted logic, but that by the way production is managed and manufactured, there are certain value rankings that define how much worth you're seen to have in towards society. Fourthly, you're less likely to care for the society you live in on 2 levels. A, because you no longer see this society as one in which you autonomously opted into living and fundamentally care for because of your own choices, and that is why you're less likely to engage in political structures and whatnot. Now I want to talk about programmability and weighing up, because the entire GovBench is, we can mech that in. No, you can't. There are 3 reasons why you can't. Firstly, preferences are not closed structures. Individuals develop preferences and wants and desires in a way that is often very hard to predict, and that is the whole reason why there's randomness and also black swan that might come through in the system. Secondly, because uniquely when you see others performing jobs that you might potentially want to acquire and adjust to and adopt, but you can't, that realization not only sparks a realization in you, but also amongst many others that there's a necessity of non-autonomy that presents itself and that manifests itself. But thirdly, the explanation for why you're doing this, that you are born with this, you're genetically codified to do this, I think that is when you realize and feel fundamentally that you're unfree, because this is not something you can ever say, I chose, because it was chosen before you were born. And that is why you can't mech that in, because that's not how debating works, guys. Weighing up. 1, we've proven that for the vast majority of people, material needs are not that important, but all of the losses we explain to you are quite large. But 2, I'd posit that for an individual, what makes life good and valuable is the ability to pursue what you prefer to do and what you want to do. You can always relativize your preferences to some extent against your material circumstances, which is why, even if you may not be super rich, you may still be content and happy. But I'd say you can never relativize yourselves against relations that alienate you and structures that oppress you, because these are systems that exist and exist everywhere in a panopticon manner. And for all of those reasons, I'm so proud to oppose today. Thank you.
When I first read Brave New World, I was genuinely confused because they present us with a world in which people are truly happy. Everyone is having orgies and doing drugs all the time, watching great movies, and have literally no concerns. And the dilemma presented to us by Aldous Huxley is this a utopia or dystopia? The problem is no one in this round has given you any structural or principled reasons about what a state owes to us and what a state of existence is really supposed to be like. That's what Ed told you. He told you the state is fundamentally failing people in the status quo, not just because they're hungry, but specifically because material well-being is the most important thing that a state ought to provide. And I sure as hell am not going to go out in my last ever debate round by someone lecturing me on the Indian caste system. So we're going to start by dealing with CO and then talk about the extension where the round actually is. 3 things I want to say on CO. The first thing they say is the status quo is not so bad. Give a couple of numbers with some labels on them without a lot of mechanisms here. Here's the reason they're wrong and the reason I think the world is more terrifying than it has ever been before and the utopia of Brave New World is better. Firstly, I think more people are alienated and lonely than they have ever been because of the globalization they tell you about, because they compare themselves on social media and Instagram. They think people are better than each other, which means all of the relational stuff that OO tells you is actually worse on their side of the house. On our side of the house, if people are happy and drugged and everyone is equal because you've created social equalization through these classes, things are better. Also, I think things are worse for minorities than they have ever been. There are more black men in prison now than were enslaved. So if they want to tell me about slavery and the problems of that, I think things are getting even worse in the status quo. On the argument that the poor are going to be more taken care of because of late-stage capitalism and so forth, explain to me how that's actually solving the problems of most people, because we live in a world where there's literally more inequality than there has ever been. The disparate wealth distribution is the worst it's ever been. You can look at that margarita glass that people show you of like how the top 1% have most of the income and everyone else has literally nothing. This arbitrary number of 95% of people are well off is literally not true, and it's just proven by their opening, which says people are really relational and want to compare themselves to each other. If people are taking soma and everyone is drugged and having orgies and having fun all the time, everyone can relate to one another. There's literally no race. I think all of these problems don't exist. What's the end of this rebuttal I've given you? The world is getting worse. It's pretty bad already. On the other side of the house, at least just the material happiness is clearly going to be better. Let's deal with what the extension was, which is this idea that you shouldn't functionalize roles and we should help everyone. 2 responses to this. Firstly, I think there's no reason inherently that this specific iteration of people having roles is a bad thing. It's probably a good thing for people to be given a specific purpose. Like, I'm good at programming, so I'm like, should I represent women in computer science and have to be a coder, or should I do stuff that I'm more passionate about, like doing things like literature or like gene editing and stuff like that I like have intellectual interest in. I think the confusion created by choices is not necessarily good. I know this rebuttal also takes out opening opposition because they just say choices are good, but they don't explain to me why just having n number of more choices is necessarily better if you're confused about what those choices are, or the decisions between those choices are not necessarily good. But the second thing, and this is just the killer for their extension, is the response Ed already gave you, which is that you're rotating roles every single generation. There's no more trust funds. There's no more generational inequality. There is no more racial inequality, because these things literally do not exist. We have randomized the lottery of birth truly for the first time, such that the generational inequalities that made these functionalized roles so bad are finally solved on our side of the house. That means there's literally no extension here. The final thing that they ran out of time for, because they had bad time allocation, was this idea of programmability. Look, if you have hypnopadia and soma, which means that basically people are lulled to think they don't actually have desires, you don't want it. And this piece of rebuttal is particularly important. All of the social change they tell you about literally doesn't matter if people have no material reasons to agitate for that change. Like, the biggest reasons people agitate for social change is because their base desires are not met. But if you solve the reasons that get people so angry they're willing to leave their jobs, so angry that they're willing to uproot social orders, if you solve those, I think the need for social change goes away. Before I go on, I'll take opening.
Most of your responses are symmetric. For example, Facebook and Instagram exist on both worlds in this debate.
No, there's no Facebook in our world. Read the book. I really hope people read the book, because people are too busy doing drugs and having orgies. They have a great time. It's a really good book. I hope people read it. Okay, the extension. Here's why the extension is particularly important and why it takes out the best case version of side opposition, which hasn't really been built. Look, their conception is like people should be able to allocate preferences, and that's what the state should do, and it's all about choice. Ed told you that's not the relationship you ought to have with the state, because if I have a relationship with the state where they say you can choose between, I don't know, being able to be a housewife or being able to have a specific type of job in the care industry, that's not a meaningful choice, because there is a choice. And anyway, in the status quo, the state restricts choices all the time. Like we told you in our POI, it's not just in the US, like unless the US is the only state where people have to follow laws, in which case I'm really worried about what you guys are gonna do. Here's the important thing. He showed you that material well-being is the necessary prerequisite to making sure the state fulfills its obligation to you. It's a precondition of being able to actualize things, and this goes beyond what our opening says, where they say hunger makes you feel pain, and they presume that the world is a utilitarian world. We don't presume that. We say, irregardless of what moral system you believe, it's necessary for the state to make sure these fundamental things are satisfied in the first place, because those are the things that define what make a good state. The ability to have free time, the ability to think, the ability to have the health and ability to remove the pain necessary is what makes the preconditions for consent exist in the first place. This solves the deadlock in opening half, where they're like, are people less happy or are people less able to give consent? Because our argument is consent can only stem, and the ability of having a legitimate state can only consent if you're able to have this type of system. Now let's deal with opening opposition. It's unfortunate they didn't take our POI, because it takes out literally everything they said. Because on their side of the house, you would ban parents being able to take care of their children and make decisions for you, as Ed told you, because you would say, you're restricting people's ability to make choices. You're restricting their ability to make decisions for themselves. Note that insofar as we believe it's legitimate for parents, for example, to send their kids to school, even if the kids don't have full decision in it, because it leads to better material outcomes for them, and that's totally legitimate, the state is essentially acting as a good mom because they're actually making sure people's needs are satisfied. They're actually fulfilling their obligations to the people. Note that this takes out the majority of what opening gives you, because the idea of people being unhappy and so forth and the precondition for happiness isn't true. We also proved to you, which is the only real matter coming out of the DLO, that where they say this is only a precondition for happiness, but it's not sufficient. We showed not only is this sufficient, it's necessary, sufficient, and the only thing the state has the obligation to. The only reason we left the state of nature, the only reason things have value, the only reason I value this phone is because it has value to me, because I decided it is the thing I desire. So if we live in a world where if the things people desire are material things, material well-beings, and we provide those things to them, that is exactly what the state has owed these people in the first place. And so we're fulfilling a higher order desire to them. What is the comparative for them? They're living in a world where the state is already restricting choices and so forth, so their comparative doesn't really exist, and it's probably going to get worse because of the systematic exclusion of people from these democratic systems, which is why these protests are struggling. On our side of the house, people are legitimately happy and fulfill the actual obligation the state has to them. Very proud to propose. Cool.
Panel, there's a reason that when I got the first opportunity to drop philosophy, I did so. And the reason for that is, I think, evident in open half. Everyone kind of sits there just wanking themselves off about how much they know about philosophy while refusing to actually engage, be comparative, or even talk about impacts. That is the key thing that we do bring you at Brian, and we bring you in closing. Because I noticed one thing, despite the fact that I dropped philosophy, is that when I came from New Zealand, I couldn't get over how grumpy English people were. They had so much more than I did, but they just didn't seem to be enjoyment. And the reason for that is the pursuit of happiness that I had and my ability to own my decisions to move from New Zealand to the UK, to actually get that, was really, really crucial. I don't know why Chin is clapping here, because there's absolutely nothing that he said that. Last time I checked, he didn't even come from New Zealand. But there's one thing that we do tell you at Bright, and the reason 3 levels we win this debate. First is on the comparative of the two worlds, being the first team to actually look like what these worlds are going to look like in terms of individuals. Secondly, we tell you the pursuit of choice is the most important thing in leading to the progression of society and of the individual. And thirdly, in terms of happiness, and why you should weigh this in terms of societal and community happiness over material happiness. Firstly, then, on a comparative of the two worlds. Because what we hear from essentially from OG, and their case kind of reduces to this, is that the world at the moment is very, very shit, and it's really bad, and we should improve it. Brian tells you a variety of reasons why the world is indeed getting better. The incentive to care about a new voter base, the incentive for politicians to target them, and the massive improvement and uplifting we've seen of millions of people, particularly those in the developing world, China. But what we hear essentially from CG is, no, actually, it's just getting worse. so much better. That just kind of sounds like a little bit like OG, but with like the progression put onto it. But I've got 3 key responses to that. The first is to say it is just a factual lie that the world is getting worse. That is not true. We have told you that we see middle classes being absorbed into the new voter base because they are worth something now. We've seen the uplifting of millions of people of poverty. Secondly, though, we say that the ability for individuals to live in different communities under the status quo means they have different conceptions of what a good life is and what success is. So they do indeed gain happiness from those around them and that relativism. Thirdly, though, for the worst of the worst that exist within the status quo, I think we need to draw the comparative to the worst that exists within their world. Because even if everyone has a degree of material wealth that is equal, there is still a degree of hierarchy between the good jobs and functional roles of society that you are indeed set in. So it is not the case that everyone is magically equal under their side, and in fact, they still have hierarchy. Why is that worse then? And this is the structural reasons that Brian gives you about a segmented system, which get very poor responses from CO. They tell you that essentially, what we tell you is essentially you get a feeling that your position within society is now deserved. That means that if you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, that's incredibly harmful for you because you think you're meant to be equal and you're not. Secondly, though, you now see people only in terms of a functional system, that is to say, to perform like a result for society, not as the value of the human being they are themselves. And thirdly, your ability and your incentive to innovate and actually progress as society massively diminishes because you see like your baseline is written and there's no need to get better. At the end of that, it is clear that the world in which government bench wants to live in is incredibly harmful and incredibly not beneficial for the pursuit of the individual. Secondly, then, in terms of choice. Because what I think what opening government essentially brings to you is that the capability that you have limits your ability to necessarily fulfill your preferences. So in and of the sense, you are not free. I think that OO attempts to kind of refute this, but with some like emotional rhetoric, but doesn't really get there, right? And then CG comes back up and goes, no, here are 4 more reasons why that's limited. It's kind of the same point, they just mixed it out and said that they had numbers when it was pretty much the same thing. What do we uniquely tell you? And I think this is crucial in winning the round. We make the distinction between fulfilling your preferences and the pursuit to do so. That is to say, you get massive benefits from believing that you're owning your decisions, that you're making a progression as an individual towards an outcome. Secondly, though, I think it's vastly uncomparative what we hear from government, because that is to say, in their world, there is no pursuit of meaning at all, because your meaning is defined for you by the social construct that is placed upon you. What we tell you then is that actually you are far more hopeless in their world. And this responds directly to what OG says, and your ability to change the system makes you hopeless. Because note, their world is literally zero choice in the pursuit of what you do as an individual. Zero choice in the ability to pursue and progress society. That is incredibly harmful. How do you weigh this then in the debate? We tell you that on our side, the ability to pursue choice and to be able to act like you actually are ending, you create the means to your ends, means you get societal progress, means you get individuals progressing on a level you don't. That is a potential freedom that is unique to our side and a unique benefit. Before I talk about happiness and the pursuit of preferences to lead to why you weigh this more than material well-being, I will take opening.
What is more important? Sense of choice between studying at Oakland or Oxford with some chance of poverty alleviation, or helping people with food, nutrition, and medicine who are most in the need of it, guaranteed on our side of the house.
Cool. Okay, so this is perfectly lines into my next point. So I'll do the weighing first because I think it nicely responds to the POI. You have to weigh up necessarily between a trade-off between your physical well-being that is apparently perfect on their side and an emotional well-being. Why do we care more about the emotional one? The reason for this is what Brian tells you. Because when you meet a physical material well-being, it is diminishing in its return. Once you hit a benchmark, you cannot go that much beyond that. For social and emotional pursuit, it is endless panel. It is never ending and never ending in terms of it being fulfilling. So even if it is the case, you have to weigh off and you believe their material, although I think you should not, given what me and myself and Brian tell you. You also need to note that social and emotional is endless. Why then in terms of preferences? Because what essentially OG says is that your preferences are engineered now, so you necessarily cannot oppose the individual ones that you get there. I think we effectively prove, well, even when you are born into this construct that they exist upon, your preferences don't necessarily map on into what you are engineerily constructed to do that. And that's for the reason that you necessarily fluctuate between preferences, or you notice what other people are doing and you acquire knowledge. What does that mean? It means that the degree of fulfillment you are guaranteed to get on-site opposition is significantly significantly lower, because it is not the case that you necessarily feel like your pursuit of freedom or your pursuit of happiness in terms of fulfilling your preferences is ever met under their side. I think at the end of the debate panel, you have to consider this. If it is the case that you believe their material well-being, what is the end goal of that world? It is a very small baseline in terms of pursuit of freedom or even of happiness. At our side, we give people the ability and the right to pursue that, to pursue better individual development and also societal progression. For that reason, CO.
Few minutes, we're going to be starting the public speaking finals. We ask if any public speaking finalists are in the room, please go upstairs to 204 for the briefing. If you are a public speaking finalist judge, please come to the left of the stage. Audience are welcome to stay.